From time to time, like CII, the Construction Users Roundtable gives awards to outstanding performance, distinguished service, etc. While our awards event is on November the 9th, I think, over in Coral Gables, Florida, where we will be recognizing outstanding safety performance, productivity, project excellence, workforce. From time to time, we decide that we need to provide or recognize someone for their outstanding service. And it's my honor to do that right now. Anirban Basu, I want you to join me prematurely on the stage. I know that you're going to be speaking momentarily, but we have elected at the Construction Users Roundtable to present you with the Outstanding Service Award for the Construction Users Roundtable. I'll tell you why this is important in a minute. We'll let Stan grab a shot right there, and you give a hearty applause to Anirban. I'll send it to you. Congratulations to you. Thank you. Stay here with us. So let me tell you a little bit about my buddy Anirban Basu. He is the chairman and CEO of the SAGE Policy Group, which is an economic policy consulting firm in Metro DC, in Baltimore, actually. And they provide statistical analysis and economic analysis to law firms, medical systems, governmental agencies, and he also serves as the chief economist for the Associated Builders and Constructors. Shortly ago, the governor of Maryland named him chair of the Maryland Economic Development Commission. And he has also been named to other advisory capacities. In addition to CURT, he has served as an economic advisor to the folks of the Construction Users Roundtable and is highly regarded for his expertise. He lectures at Johns Hopkins on global strategy, micro and macroeconomics, and does an outstanding job. The governor also announced that he was one of the 50 most influential citizens of Maryland not too long ago. And the Baltimore Journal named him one of the region's most powerful and influential among 20 business leaders in the greater Baltimore area. You're going to know why right now. He has a BS in Foreign Service from Georgetown. He has a master's in public policy at Harvard. He has a master's in economics at the University of Maryland. And he has a law degree also from the University of Maryland School of Law. And after all that, he decided to go make some money. We're glad that he's here with us. Give it up once again for my buddy Anirban Basu. Oh, here we go.
Righto. I think you can.
There we go.
Oh, there it is. Good morning. Thank you. Thank you for the award. I think my work here is done, as it turns out. But I'll go ahead and give you a presentation. So my job today is to talk about the economy. And I will leave some time at the end for questions and answers. So please think about what questions you'd like to ask as I go through the material. Obviously, a lot of waterfront to cover. We're going to talk about a lot of things. Construction, of course, is one of them, but we'll talk about also the context in which construction services are delivered and consumed. My presentation today, if we can get that up, is Anirban Basu and the Chamber of Data. Can we get that up on these screens? Okay, I know what I look like. Is it? Oh, is it right here? Oh, I'm in the way is what the problem is. Okay. So, gotcha. So that's fine. Oh, see, that's what I want. So Anirban Basu and the Chamber of Data, this is a Harry Potter themed presentation. And you'll see that theming throughout the presentation this morning, whether you like it or not. It's sort of baked into the cake. I know that I am speaking to people who are in engineering and architectural services and you know, from large organizations that consume construction services and contractors themselves. So this might be a complete miss. It might be too whimsical by half. I understand that. Nonetheless, that is the theme, and we'll get into the economy right now. And I think you would agree that though we have now been in this period of pandemic in North America for about 18 months, and that though on occasion at least we've seen light at the end of the tunnel, and here we are together, and it's wonderful to be with each other, that the number one factor that continues to shape global economic outcomes continues to be COVID-19. And of course, the impacts derive from the behavioral shifts that this has rendered. Now, some of those behavioral shifts were mandated by government in many instances, but many of these behavioral shifts are voluntary in nature, and I want to make a distinction between the two as we go through this, and I also want to distinguish between which behavioral changes are permanent and which are temporary, because that will, of course, shape economic outcomes as well. Now, we've been prisoners of our homes, of course. Not every American family looks like this. Some do, many don't, most don't, in fact. But that's been one of the behavioral changes. A lot of people have become accustomed to spending more time at home. It has also altered what we buy and how we buy, those kinds of things. All those things affect real estate and ultimately demand for construction services and the price of, therefore, those services. Now, it was a shared global pandemic, of course, and yet the response of various people to this public health crisis has been very differential in nature. It's been different across governments, whether national governments or state governments. It's been different across households, different across cultures. And even though it was a shared global pandemic, the economic outcomes during the pandemic have been quite different society by society, state by state. This is a reflection of 2020 economic growth in various societies around the world. Now, these data come from the International Monetary Fund. On this map, green is good because green signifies growth. And you'll notice that there is some green here, that there were some nations that in 2020, during the pandemic, managed to expand economically, most prominently China, home to the second largest economy in the world. The Chinese economy grows 2.3% last year, and that has a lot to do, of course, with the Americans. Because the Americans, and I'll show you data on this later on in the presentation, ended up buying a lot of goods last year. And they ended up buying a lot of goods online last year, and that stimulated the Chinese supply chain. We're not alone, of course, in doing that. But since China is home to 1/4 of global manufacturing, anytime that manufacturing is stimulated, China's economy would tend to be as well. They're not alone. The Laotian economy grows, the Vietnamese economy grows 2.9% last year, the Taiwanese economy 3%, the Egyptian economy grew. You can see in Western Africa, some of these natural resource-intensive societies like the Ivory Coast grew. East of the Caspian Sea, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan grew, also natural resource-intensive societies. Red is bad, because red means that economies shrank. You can see North America bathed in red. And I can offer you some additional detail around this same data source here, but now actual statistics, actual figures. So if you look toward the bottom of the slide, you can see that estimate of 2.3% growth in China last year. If you look toward the middle of the slide, you'll see that the estimate for the US economy is that the US economy shrank 3.5% last year. Not the worst performers in North America. That distinction belongs to the Mexicans, that economy shrinking more than 8% in 1 year. The Canadian economy shrinking more than 5%. And North America was not the worst performer. That distinction might very well belong to the Europeans. The Italian economy shrinking nearly 9%, the French economy more than 8%, the Spanish economy 11%, and the United Kingdom suffering its worst year economically since 1709. That, of course, the year of the Great Frost. That economy shrinking 9.9% last year. So most of the world suffered economically last year. Now, for me to indicate to you that the US economy shrank 3.5% last year would be A, accurate, and B, would miss out on a ton of nuance. There were moments, of course, during which US economic performance was perfectly dismal last year, but there are also moments during which the US economy bounced back with tremendous and, in fact, unexpected force. This is quarterly GDP. Now, there are two colors of bars here, blue and red. The blue-colored bars are indexed to the left-hand vertical axis. The red-colored bars to the right-hand vertical axis. I had to bifurcate the vertical axis, which sounds and is excruciatingly painful. And I'll explain why I did this in a moment. Now, the last blue-colored bar is the fourth quarter of 2019. That was the last pre-pandemic or pre-pandemic crisis quarter in America, the fourth quarter of 2019. You'll remember that marching into 2020, the US economy has plentiful momentum. In fact, the US economy is rocking. We're adding jobs. We added jobs in January of 2020. We added 289,000 jobs in February of 2020. The principal challenge facing many enterprises in the economy, of course, was can't find workers, which, by the way, is a principal challenge today. We'll get into that. Can't find workers. But of course, we shut down the economy in March of 2020, in particular the last 3 weeks of March. And the last 3 weeks of March are so horrific economically that though we had momentum in January and into February, evidence of economic growth, those last 3 weeks of March take the entire first quarter of 2020 down with it. The first red-colored bar here, again, indexed to the right-hand axis, is the first quarter of 2020, and that quarter the U.S. economy shrinks 5% on an annualized basis. Now, that's big news by itself. During the fourth quarter of 2008, which had been the worst quarter of our economic lives, the U.S. economy shrinks 8.4%. So a negative 5% print is a big deal. That was enough. Unfortunately, that was merely the appetizer this time around. For during the second quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy declines 31.4% on an annualized basis. That's that big negative red bar you see there, and that's why I had to bifurcate the vertical axis. Because if I try to graph a number of that magnitude on a single unified vertical axis, all these other vertical bars simply disappear from view. And around that time, there was a raging debate that opened up in the economics community about what the initial phase of recovery might look like. Would it be U-shaped, L-shaped, Nike swoosh, check mark, square root, hockey stick? It was a straight up V. For during the third quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy bounces back, growing 33.4% on an annualized basis, demonstrating that under the right circumstances, the U.S. economy is capable of exuding massive recuperative power, which matters because that will help us shape our forecast for the balance of 2021 into 2022. But America is capable of that kind of recovery. Now, for reasons we'll get into the fourth quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy starts to lose momentum once again. Stimulus is injected into the economy on December 27th of last year, then again on March 11th of this year. That sets the stage for faster economic growth during the first half of 2021. We grow 6.3% during the first quarter of 2021, and then 6.5% during the now completed second quarter of the year. Now, true, and we'll explain this, many economists coming into the second quarter predicted 10% growth. Others predicted 8% growth. We got 6.5%. And one of the things I want to explain is why U.S. economic growth, though strong by historic standards, has been so disappointing recently, or at least somewhat disappointing. Now, and again, though we expanded economically during the latter stages of last year, it is still the case that the U.S. economy ended last year smaller than it began the year. And there are many implications to a shrunken economy. Let's start exploring some of those, and let's begin with a discussion of the U.S. labor market. Now, this next slide will have the same type of setup, blue color bars and red color bars, except now instead of quarterly gross domestic product, this is monthly employment change in America. Now, the last blue colored bar here is the month of February 2020. February 2020 is the last blue colored bar here, again, indexed to the left-hand vertical axis. Again, that's a month during which America added 289,000 jobs. February of 2020 represented the culmination of a 113-month period during which America added jobs each and every month, with one exception, February of 2019, which happened to be very cold. But otherwise, for 113 consecutive months, we basically added jobs without interruption consistently. And over that 113-month period, America added 22 million net new jobs. We drive the official rate of unemployment in this country down to 3.5%. That was a 50-year low. You'd have to go back to December of 1969 to find unemployment as low as it had been pre-crisis. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, the Orioles were good back then. I'm from Baltimore, I know such things. It was a long time ago. The first red color bar is March of 2020, again, indexed to the right-hand axis. We shut down the economy that month. And in March, the economy sheds 1.7 million jobs. But that's misleading, because the so-called reference week, the week during which the underlying survey was conducted, was relatively early in March. So a lot of the jobs lost in March of 2020 didn't show up in that March of 2020 jobs report. They would show up in the April of 2020 jobs report, along with some of the jobs lost in April, of course. And in April of 2020, America loses 20.7 million jobs. That's that big negative red bar that you see there. So if you do the math on that, and again, that's why I bifurcated the vertical axis, but if you do the math on that, between March and April of last year, America loses about 22 million jobs, precisely the number of jobs we had added during the previous 113 months. We gave all of that back, years of economic progress after the Great Recession, back in a few weeks. And around that time, the Wall Street Journal conducted a survey of economists, mostly economists who work for large US financial institutions, also some prominent academics, not small business operators like myself. And those economists predicted that in May of 2020, America would lose another 8 million jobs, bringing that tally, of course, to negative 30 million and adding to our collective, our shared misery. But they were wrong. We did not lose 8 million jobs in May of 2020. We added 2.8 million of them, followed by 4.8 million jobs added in June of 2020, and then 1.7 million jobs in July, and 1.6 million in August, and 716,000 in September, and 680,000 jobs in October. Fabulous. That V-shaped recovery. Again, demonstrating that America is capable of remarkable recuperative power. Again, for reasons we'll get into the fourth quarter, the US economy begins to lose momentum. By December, America's losing jobs again. Again, stimulus injected into the economy December 27th of last year, March 11th of this year. We've been adding jobs ever since, culminating with the June jobs report, a month during which America adds 850,000 jobs. Now, we have a record number of job openings in this country, 9.2 million available unfilled jobs. Many employers, of course, are screaming about can't find workers. And what makes this especially puzzling is that we're nowhere close to complete recovery in the labor market. Ostensibly, there should be lots of people looking to fill jobs. But as you know, that has not been the case. And that may be one of the permanent changes to American society, that people's desire to work, their willingness to work. And one of the things that I've also heard from various employers is that with respect to thinking about which job to fill, that job seekers have become like consumers, very picky. They want a certain set of characteristics. They want, of course, flex time. They want benefits. They also want more pay for the privilege of doing less work. So I'll give you an example. I'll just give you one example. A recent survey came out of people who do not have a college degree. That was the subsegment that was surveyed. People who do not have a college degree. Their requirements to fill a job opening are up 27% since the pandemic began. That translates into $13,000 per year. People are asking for more. And if they don't see more being offered by the employer, flex time, ability to work from home, whatever it happens to be, they don't fill the job. So again, ostensibly, there should be lots of folks looking for work because if you compare February of 2020 employment in this country versus June of 2021, despite that V-shaped recovery, we're still down 6.8 million jobs. So why this 16-month comparison period, by the way? February of 2020 is the last pre-pandemic crisis month in America, at least for the economy, and June of 2021 is the last month for which we have these data. We're in August now, but we still are waiting for the July data. So 16-month comparison period, these horizontal bars represent the number of jobs lost by each of these industry categories on this 16-month basis. So what I'm trying to say here is that leisure and hospitality is down 2.2 million jobs. That's your restaurant worker and your hotel worker. And many of those entrepreneurs are asking the question, why is my old staff, my former staff, not coming back? Where are they? One of the other things that we saw, and this very much affects construction, is that a lot of baby boomers retired early. Now, they retired early for a number of reasons. One, 401k got really fat. Time to move to Florida. Or they lost a job early during the pandemic and said, enough is enough, I'm done. But in many cases, those boomers are our most productive workers, committed to the world of work, devoted to the mission of their employers, those kinds of things. Many of those folks have left the workforce, and of course, many will continue to during the years ahead. Every major category you can see has lost jobs on a year-ago basis, but the job loss was disproportionate among entry-level and near entry-level workers, as it turns out. Retail, trade, leisure and hospitality, so on and so forth. Now, let me give you some regional economic detail. This is employment growth for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America. Again, February 2020 versus June of 2021. So you'll see that 16-month comparison period a lot. Pre-pandemic to the latest period for which we have data. Now, this is a mistitled slide. There is no employment growth here. Every one of the nation's 25 largest metropolitan areas lost jobs on this 16-month basis, but some regions held on to a far greater share of their pre-existing base of employment than others. At the top of the list, San Antonio, Texas. Beautiful city, of course. Who's the governor of Texas? Greg Abbott. Greg Abbott has been one of these governors very aggressive in keeping that economy open, even during the worst of the pandemic. You'll see at number 3, Dallas. At number 4 is Tampa, not so far from here. That's Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. Again, one of these governors very keen, very aggressive in keeping this economy open during the worst of the crisis. At number 6 is Phoenix. That's Arizona's Governor Doug Ducey. Again, very aggressive. At number 7 is Atlanta. That's Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia. Brian Kemp was the first governor in the country to reopen his economy, happened on April 20th of last year. And sometimes you will hear Georgians suggest, not folks from Atlanta as it turns out, but folks from other parts of Georgia suggest we never really shut down this economy. So some governors have been more focused on the economic and employment outcomes. And I can tell you, the Delta variant will not cause Ron DeSantis to shut down this economy. That's just not who he is. So some governors are more focused on the economic and employment outcomes. Other governors are more focused on the public health aspects of this. Now, at the bottom of the second column, you see the regions that have lost the highest share of their jobs relative to the pre-pandemic base of employment. At number 25, Orlando, more than 10% of all jobs lost. This market. So Anirban, sir, you won an award, but they should take it back. Because Orlando's in Florida. That's Governor Ron DeSantis, same state, same governor. What, sir, is your narrative? Obviously, the structure of Orlando's economy. Theme parks, leisure and hospitality, retail trade. It's about in-person experience, like what we're having today, not about remote work, for instance. And one could make the argument that the leading policymaker in the Orlando area is not Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, nor even the mayor of Orlando, but Disney. And Disney, of course, has had capacity constraints throughout the pandemic and limits to employment, those kinds of things. At number 23, San Francisco. At number 24, Los Angeles. Who's the governor of California? The wickedly handsome Gavin Newsom. Himself could be a Hollywood actor. Very aggressive in keeping that economy shut down. Not himself shut down so much, a bit of a party animal. But that economy very aggressive. In fact, he was the last governor in the country to reopen his economy, which happened a few weeks ago. At number 22, New York. I think everyone knows this morning that the governor of New York is Andrew Cuomo. His counterpart in New Jersey is Phil Murphy. Again, very aggressive in keeping that economy shut down. And of course, New York City, along with some of the California markets, were early-stage viral epicenters. So one of the things they saw fit to do in New York was to shut down mass transit to limit the spread of COVID-19, obviously. And when you shut down mass transit, you end up shutting down a lot of the New York metropolitan area economy. It is not for me to say, by the way, which is the better approach. The economic or employment approach, keep the economy open, or defend public health approach. That's for you to decide. I'm merely suggesting the obvious as an economist that such decisions have major economic implications. In fact, at number 21 is San Diego, that's California. At number 20 is Miami. Again, a market that depends heavily upon tourism, and particularly international leisure tourism, which obviously basically came to a halt during the bulk of the pandemic, so on and so forth. At number 18 is Boston. That's Governor Charlie Baker of Massachusetts. Happens to be a Republican, by the way. Roy Cooper of North Carolina is a Democrat. So it's not just purely partisan. A lot of this has to do with what were the early stage viral epicenters and, of course, the region of the country. In any case, these things have economic implications. What about unemployment? I mentioned earlier that we came into the crisis with a 3.5% rate of unemployment. By April of 2020, we're around 14.7 to 14.8%. Now, here I'm offering you some additional granularity. I'm showing you male unemployment in blue, female unemployment in green, and overall unemployment in red. Now, during the previous economic downturn, the so-called Great Recession, men suffered much more economically. And that had a lot to do with the 2.3 million jobs lost in the construction industry, the worst among any industry in terms of job loss, manufacturing coming in a close second, during the period of its downturn. And you remember that the construction downturn begins well before the broader recession, as the housing market starts to collapse around 2006. The recession began in late 2007. This time was different. This time women took it on the chin, at least early in the pandemic. Leisure and hospitality, retail trade, home health, salons, daycare centers, private schools, public schools. A lot of female-dominated occupational categories implicated directly by the pandemic. So in April of 2020, while the overall rate of unemployment is around 14.7 to 14.8%, for women that month it's 16.1%, for men that month 13.6%. Now you can see the improvement since that time. By June, we're down to 5.9% unemployment. Now this is somewhat misleading, admittedly, because since the pandemic has begun, several million Americans have left the labor market altogether. They're neither working nor looking for work. The labor force participation rate in this country is stuck at 61.6%. Despite all these job openings that you might think would be inducing more Americans to leap into the labor market, is just not happening. That notwithstanding, if you flip this line upside down, and why on God's green earth would you do that, is because less is more here. The lower the number, the better. So if you flip this line upside down, you would see the letter V. Again, V for vibrancy or vitality or partial restoration thereof. Unemployment rates for those same 25 massive metropolitan areas, many of you come from one of these regions. The lowest is in Brian Kemp's state of Georgia. The highest is in Gavin Newsom's state of California. Not much surprise there. Now, let's talk about some other aspects of economic life, that correlate to the labor market. So one of the other things that we have seen is, another aspect of the V-shaped recovery. This is industrial production. This is a reflection of the output of the nation's manufacturers, mines, and utilities. V-shaped recovery. So one of the things that we hear from manufacturers is, you know what, I could produce even more. I can't find welders. I can't find machinists. You might remember in economics, in microeconomics in particular, the professor would draw an upward sloping supply curve, do you remember that? And a downward sloping demand curve, and they would meet at this fabulous market clearing point, which would be associated with the equilibrium price. And it was just magical, because everyone got what they wanted on the chalkboard. Everyone got what they wanted, right? At that market equilibrium price. The market was cleared, it was beautiful. And then late in the lecture, once everyone had lost interest, the professor would draw that vertical supply curve, which stood for the proposition that at some point you're capacity constrained, you can't supply anymore. Doesn't matter what happens to price, suppliers are done. They just cannot supply anymore. That's where we are right now. And I'll talk more about the implications of this for construction as I go through the presentation, but you can sort of see it in this. There's a lot of demand for manufacturing output right now. I'll give you an example, automobiles. There's a lot of demand for automobiles, of course. What do we know about automobile production? It's down. Why? Not enough semiconductors. That's a vertical supply curve. Doesn't matter what the price is, suppliers cannot supply more. They don't have the inputs. This is capacity utilization index. So we're stuck at around 75%, 75.4% as it turns out, of capacity utilization. Why can't we, if there's such shortages in the economy, steel and aluminum and softwood lumber and automobiles, why can't we increase capacity utilization? Can't find the workers to work with the equipment. And again, a lot of that has to do with the retirement of baby boomers in large numbers, the folks who grew up working with equipment because they went to shop class. Something we don't have anymore. And part of the problem here is cultural. It's that at some point we Americans, parents especially, became convinced that the only pathway to prosperity in America is through a 4-year college degree. And for many of us, of course, that has been the pathway to prosperity. That's true. But it's not the pathway for everyone. Colleges are about to start up again. We're in early August. College will start up in, let's say, late August to early September. And at some point, there will be a young man or young woman who will have registered for a French literature class, who will be studying Sartre and Camus and Molière. Maybe they'll start the class by presenting Molière's finest play, Tartuffe, and they will hate it. But they would be the world's greatest carpenter. They just don't know that because they were never exposed to that in the first place. So lots of things going on here, but the point is we are capacity constrained. And many of the capacity limits come from the labor force, and many of those capacity limits coming from the labor force are cultural in nature, which means it's very difficult to change. In other words, it's not simply about offering more pay. When I was growing up, what did we care about? Money. You want us to work? Pay us, no problem. Greed is good, we were taught. And I'll give you an example. So some of you take Ubers and Lyfts all the time. You might remember after a recent stimulus payment, it was very hard to find Ubers and Lyfts. Why is that? Because people value other things these days other than money, which makes me sick as an economist. Where are people's priorities? Because if you can't get them to drive with surge pricing, you're done. And what we're seeing from a lot of these younger people in particular is they set a goal in their mind. So Uber and Lyft have this surge pricing. The notion is if we raise the price of the fares, more people will turn on their app, come on out and drive, and then those supply-demand imbalances will cure themselves. But a lot of these young people in particular have a goal. I want to make $150. That's what I want, or $100, whatever it is. And if you surge price, what happens? They get to $100 more quickly after fewer rides, and then they're done. They turn off the app. So again, a lot of this is generational, cultural, so on and so forth. Let's keep going. Let's talk about some of the aspects of a shrinking economy, though the economy today now is actually a bit larger than it was pre-pandemic, but again, it shrank last year. So one of the other aspects of economic life during this pandemic has been the significant intervention by government into the economy. And not just government, of course, the Federal Reserve, our central bank, quasi-governmental. So if you're familiar with the Harry Potter books and movies, you know that the government of witches and wizards is the Ministry of Magic. The Ministry of Magic. Very powerful. Now, I don't know how much magic comes out of Washington, D.C. I can tell you a lot of money did last year. 3 major stimulus packages. This first signed by Donald Trump on March 27th, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act. This was a $2.2 to $2.3 trillion package. It became the model for all subsequent stimulus packages. It included direct payments to Americans, stepped up and extended unemployment insurance, and this was also your loans and grants to businesses. This was your Paycheck Protection Program. Now, less than a month later, you'll remember the economy is in free fall by this point, so now we're talking about April of 2020. More stimulus is injected into the economy. You'll remember that hospital systems were overwhelmed by COVID-19 patients, didn't have enough intensive care unit beds, didn't have enough ventilators, didn't have enough personal protective equipment, those kinds of things. And also the paycheck protection monies ran out very, very quickly, so more money is injected in that direction. But then, for many months after April of 2020, no major stimulus was legislated by Congress or signed by the president. By that point, of course, the economy is adding millions of jobs, unemployment is falling, the economy is reopening, at least in fits and starts. But as I say, by the fourth quarter, the momentum is being lost. The stimulus had worked its way through the economy and now is beginning to dissipate in terms of its effect. By October, November, December, retail sales are sluggish again. By December, we're losing jobs. So sensing that, Congress legislates another stimulus package, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, and Donald Trump signs that package on December 27th. This is a $906 billion package, more direct payments to Americans, more extended and enhanced unemployment insurance, more grants and loans to businesses. Now, all of this news has been trumped by the latest stimulus package signed by Joe Biden on March 11th, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. This is a $1.9 trillion package, more direct payments to Americans. Americans like direct payments. And the politicians have woken up to that fact. There's also support for extended and enhanced unemployment insurance. By the way, the CDC today, has been for the last week, has been considering again, the moratorium on evictions. I don't know how people feel about this, but at least in Delta variant impacted areas or heavily Delta variant impacted areas, extending that moratorium on evictions. Again, I don't know how people feel about this. I will say this package included something that the first 3 packages did not. Direct aid to state and local governments to the tune of $350 billion. Now, please don't get me wrong. There was a lot of money that flowed from federal coffers to state and local governments last year. But it was prescribed money. It was designated for specific purposes, for instance, the purchase of PPE, or to bulk up healthcare delivery capacity generally. This $350 billion is more in the nature of general fund relief. Very few strings attached to this money. More in the nature of governor spend it in good health, Madam Mayor make wise use of it. But beyond that, we will say no more. And you might remember on Capitol Hill that raging debate last year about why we might not want to do this. offer this kind of general fund relief because we don't want to bail out states like New Jersey and Illinois. Do you remember that? That rallying cry? We don't want to bail out New Jersey and Illinois. As it turns out, there's a fair amount of antipathy in this country towards people from New Jersey and Illinois, which is perfectly preposterous to me because those are most exquisite people, at least those folks from Illinois. You'll see also more money for public health, nutrition assistance, so on and so forth. So a lot of things thrown into this package that some of which you could argue is not really COVID-19 related, but again, puts a lot of money into the economy. 40% of this money, by the way, will be spent after the end of this current federal fiscal year. So the federal fiscal year ends on September 30th of this year. So another 40% of this money, significant amount of money, 40% of 1.9 trillion, will be spent later in 2021 and then into 2022. So the economy will still have injections of stimulus into 2022, even absent what the Biden administration is currently contemplating with respect to the American Family Act and, of course, infrastructure. And undoubtedly, many of you asked the question, if we pass an infrastructure package, where will the workers come from to install the infrastructure? We already don't have enough workers. So my hope, of course, would be, as an American who wants markets to clear, that there will also be, along with that, massive training programs to create the next generation of construction workers, manufacturing workers, so on and so forth, so that we can enlarge the size of the middle class, and maybe that way, by reaching into people who haven't yet found their passions, increase the labor force participation rate. Now, you can ask the question, are we being Dumbledore? Albus Dumbledore, of course, the headmaster of Hogwarts School, Hogwarts made famous by the Harry Potter books and movies, I'm told the greatest headmaster in Hogwarts history. We came into the crisis with a $23.5 trillion national debt. This chart suggests that we're screaming towards $28 trillion. As a practical matter, we're now past $28 trillion at around $28.6 trillion as of today. I was taught in economics, there's no free lunch. There's no free lunch. And so I presume at some point we will have to pay this back. If not literally, we'll pay for it in some other way. A bond market crisis, financial collapse, much higher interest rates, denigrated currency. In some way, this is going to come back to haunt us. It's not a 2021, 2022 story, I would say that. Today, as I woke up, the yield on the 10-year Treasury, 1.202%. It's nothing. So there are plenty of folks out there around the world, including our own Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, by the way, who are willing to finance America's deficits and debt at very low rates of interest. Inflation, at least through June, 5.4%. Yield on the 10-year Treasury, 1.2%. That's a massive negative real interest rate, but that's where we are right now. You might ask the question, how is this possible, Anirban? Because I remember from economics this equation, the nominal interest rate equals real interest rate plus inflation. I don't know if you remember that equation. But the notion is that when your banker charges you interest, they're also taking into account inflation in their computation. So for instance, if inflation is running 2% a year, and the interest that they're charging you is 2%, what's their real rate of return? 0. Inflation takes it all away. You're the winner. The banker does not want you to win. They want to win. So the notion is the higher is inflation, the higher goes the interest rate. So of course, inflation has gone up, interest rates have gone down. And you might ask the question, how is that possible, Anirban? The answer is liquidity. The massive amounts of money new money supply being poured into the economy. The same thing that contributes to inflation, all this money supply growth, also means that there's more money available to just sit in bonds, earning very low rates of interest and keeping interest rates low. It cannot be a permanent equilibrium. So at some point, something has to give. Either inflation has to plummet or interest rates have to skyrocket. Maybe we'll have a chance to deal with that more during Q&A. Let's keep going through this. The implications of the pandemic. So again, I mentioned earlier that the pandemic, of course, altered what we buy and how we buy it. We bought a lot of stuff online. Last year, for instance, was a really tough year for brick-and-mortar retailers. We, in particular, suffered a lot of bankruptcy among significant retailers across the country, which is one of the many reasons commercial real estate is in such bad shape. So much vacant retail space around the country. So much vacant office space, of course, as remote work has become not just more pervasive, but sticky. It's hard to get people to come back to work these days. I was mentioning to someone before I got up here that I was at a meeting. I get invited to speak to companies sometimes, and I was at a meeting. I should have probably been there, but I was in the room. The supervisor was saying, this is our schedule for getting back into the office. And a young man, a millennial, stood up and said, "You're making us come back to the office is dehumanizing," which I thought was a bit dramatic, I have to tell you. But anyway, so again, we suffered a lot of retail bankruptcies last year. So back in February, before the crisis became one in North America, Pier 1 Imports goes bankrupt, closing all of its stores, so you can still buy their merchandise online. In April, True Religion, the manufacturer of those most excellent jeans that make everyone look slender, they go bankrupt in April, as I say. Then Neiman Marcus, JCPenney, J. Crew go bankrupt in May of last year. These are big bankruptcies. In June, GNC, the provider of those most excellent supplements that many of us take to build up our health, to build up our energy, to build up our musculature. I pop these pills like crazy. I still have the arms of an accountant. Then Brooks Brothers goes bankrupt in July. Lord & Taylor, that Howell department store, goes bankrupt in August. And then late last year, Francesca's, which is one of my daughter's all-time favorites, so judging from their spending patterns, many of these are their all-time favorites, they go bankrupt on December 3rd. What's interesting about this is that last year was actually a really good year for retail. Unable to take vacations, unable to go to a theater, unable to go to a ballpark and pay $8 for a hot dog or $12 for a beer, we actually had a lot of money to spend on goods, on manufactured items. This is monthly retail sales. True, there was a period during which retail sales stumbled, and it begins in February of 2020. In fact, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, their Business Cycle Data Committee, the recession begins officially in February of 2020. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that retail sales begin to slide that month. By this point, you and I have heard about COVID-19. Some people are beginning to withdraw from the economy, at least partially. So we're starting to see economic activity or vigor fade by February. So the crisis begins in March. But, things do fall off the table in March and April as we shut down the economy. But then what do you see here? Again, a V-shaped recovery. A massive resurgence in retail sales. In fact, by June of last year, retail sales were above their pre-pandemic peak. And you can see they've, generally speaking, been climbing ever since. So how does one reconcile this with all the bankruptcy that we've observed among retailers in America? Well, of course, not only did the pandemic alter how we bought things, let's say moving to online, but also what we purchased. There was a market share shift in retail. This is U.S. retail sales by type of store. Again, February of 2020 versus June of 2021. That's a 16-month comparison period. These horizontal bars represent the percentage change in spending at the retail level for each of these categories over that 16-month period. So at the very top, it actually is a brick-and-mortar category. Sporting goods, hobby, book, and music stores. What's that about? That's about the sale of Peloton bikes and other exercise equipment. If people could not go to the gym, they brought the gym into their house. At number 2, the internet. That's the online. That's e-commerce. That's Jeff Bezos and Amazon. Jeff Bezos had a great year last year, not romantically, but in terms of business, they hired about 500,000 people. They've continued to hire into this year as e-commerce has continued to gobble up market share. At number 3, motor vehicles and parts dealers. That's your auto dealers. Why? They shut down mass transit. And there was also a massive push to the suburbs in terms of the residential base that I'll talk about in a moment as well. At number 4, building material and garden supplies dealers. That's your Home Depot and your Lowe's. Why? Well, what do we do a lot of, at least during the early stages of the pandemic? We spend a lot of time at home. What do people do when they're at home? They notice everything that's not right about their home. And that translates into somebody, maybe a contractor, maybe a homeowner, walking into a Home Depot or a Lowe's. Now, we're at the very bottom here. Where do we see the lack of progress in terms of retail activity? Food services and drinking places at the very bottom. Food services and drinking places, that's a fancy way of saying restaurants and bars. So most human beings call that restaurants and bars. We economists call that food services and drinking places, which is one of the many reasons many of us have never been on a date. And then going up a few categories from there, clothing and clothing accessory stores. So we have been buying a lot of clothes as a country lately because we're coming back out again. And the old stuff doesn't fit so well. So, but during the early stages of the pandemic, this segment was hammered. Why? We were at home. Who are we trying to impress? We're mostly in boxers or sweatpants. And so family knows what we look like. There's no hiding that from them. And that lines up neatly with the bankruptcies of your J. Crew, your True Religion, your Francesca's, those that depend upon, of course, apparel sales, also those department stores that went bankrupt like a Neiman Marcus or a JCPenney. Okay, enough of that. Let's talk about another aspect of economic life, restaurants. So one of the things that occurred during the crisis is that because the economy was changing so quickly from day to day to day, economists and other observers were no longer satisfied merely waiting for the monthly or the quarterly data. We wanted high-frequency data. This is about as high-frequency as it gets. Of course, the stock market is even more so, second by second. But in terms of non-financial indicators, this is a pretty high-frequency source. Open table, daily restaurant reservations. So these data come out each and every day. And the squiggly green line that you see here represents the percentage change in restaurant reservations on any given day vis-a-vis the same day in 2019, the last pre-pandemic year. So if you look toward the left of the slide, you can see that in March and April of 2020, we went down to negative 100%. We shut down the restaurant industry in the United States of America. That is a big deal. Now, my staff back in Baltimore created this slide on my behalf. They're mostly in their 20s and 30s. They're millennials. And they took the vertical axis down to negative 120%. And I need to tell them once we get back in the office that the most you can go down is negative 100%. But please set that aside. That's an internal staffing issue. Now, you can see that coming out into May and June, we start to see some progress here, right? We're getting back toward 2019 levels. Not really that close, but we're getting back. But do you see what's happening here? We have some progress, and then progress flattens out. And in fact, begins to retreat. And then progress again, and then a retreat. What happened? 4 viral surges. So the first one was in March and April of last year. Then there's another one during the summer of last year. That was the summer surge in Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Southern California, so on and so forth. Then the surge after Labor Day last year. Then the surge earlier this year. And now where are we? We're now the 5th viral surge with this Delta variant. So the progress has been uneven, inconsistent. But nonetheless, if you look at this squiggly green line, we're basically back to 2019 levels in terms of restaurant reservations. So you might ask the question, then Anirban, if we're back to 2019 levels in terms of restaurant reservations, why is it so difficult to get a restaurant reservation? Why is my favorite restaurant so overcrowded? Because, of course, there are fewer restaurants for people to go to. Many have closed. So what does that tell you about the forecast? Entrepreneurs see this as an opportunity to meet unmet demand. You'll see a lot of new restaurants opening up. You've already begun to see that, and you'll see even more, and that's part of the recovery story that'll be told during the months to come. Okay, let's keep going. Let's now get into some of the data in which you might have more interest, more direct interest, the real estate and construction data. Now, if you're familiar with the Harry Potter books and movies, you know that any student admitted into Hogwarts is allocated into one of 4 houses. There is Hufflepuff. There is Gryffindor. In fact, Harry Potter and his 2 best friends, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, are members of Gryffindor. I am from Baltimore. And every wizard from Baltimore ends up in Ravenclaw. And that's just the rule. That's just what it is. I'm just telling you what it is. I'm not making this stuff up. There are some other rules out there. So if you're from Pittsburgh, you end up in Slytherin. And again, I'm not making this stuff up. I'm just telling you what it is. And if you don't like it, you can take it up with Hogwarts administration. Now, another aspect of the pandemic has been, and I just mentioned this, interest rates have just fallen off the table. Now here I'm showing you 2 interest rates of interest, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate in blue and the 15-year fixed mortgage rate in red. Mortgage rates were low prior to the crisis. They've just collapsed during the crisis, and they remain unbelievably low. I don't think it would surprise any member of this esteemed audience that home prices in America were rising prior to the pandemic. Well, of course they were. The inventory of unsold homes was low coming to the pandemic. Job growth was rapid. Wage growth was rapid in the context of a 50-year low in unemployment. Confidence was high. Mortgage rates were favorable. Of course, home prices were rising. I think one of the great surprises of the pandemic is that home prices would have surged even though we're down 7 million jobs and our labor force is much smaller than it used to be. This is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index, and you can see that surge in home prices. Now, some people will say, clearly this is a bubble. Clearly this is another bubble forming. This is back to 03, 04, 05 as that bubble was forming. I think they're wrong. Why? Supply and demand. Because when you go out there, neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood, the inventory is almost zero in many of the most promising neighborhoods. They're bidding wars because there's a lot of demand out there. That's true for a number of reasons. During the crisis, people want to social distance more aggressively. Simpler to do that from a home than an apartment, or certainly an apartment building with an elevator. They've wanted more space because they're spending more time at home. They wanted dedicated areas for home offices and home gyms. Demographics play a part as well, as the millennials are coming of age. The oldest of the millennials will turn 40 this year. So there's all of that. But, really, very surprising. And one of the factors here is we just do not have enough supply to meet the demand. Back in 03, 04, 05, lots of supply growth. This is a residential building permit. So as I move toward the end of this presentation, and then we go into Q&A, I'm going to show you a number of leading economic indicators. Here's one. U.S. residential building permits, because if you're a builder, you've got to pull a permit before you build something. So it reflects an intention to build. And about 97, 98 times out of 100 over history, when you pull a permit, you end up building something, what you intended to build. So the segment of interest here is the red segment. That relates to single unit structures. So if you look at this slide, you'll see that prior to the pandemic, there's a bit of a surge in single-family building permits. Well, of course there was. Inventory of unsold homes is low, economy is strong, not enough supply to meet demand, builders are building more. Early stages of the pandemic, again, permits fall, they fade, for many reasons. Builders become uncertain about the future, about what demand might look like, but also many of the government agencies that issue such permits themselves are not fully operational. But then what again do you see here, ladies and gentlemen? You see the letter V for vibrancy, vitality, victory, or vindication for those of us economists who thought it'd be V-shaped. And in fact, you can see permits grew well beyond what they were pre-pandemic. Now you say, Anirban, but I'm looking at the slide very carefully, and I know that the type is small here. But lately, the single-family permits are not rising, they're shrinking. Why is that? Two-word answer, softwood lumber. But it's not just softwood lumber, it's gypsum. It's concrete slab prices. A recent study coming out of Boise, Idaho, one of our boom markets, that the price of concrete slab has more than doubled since the pandemic began in America. So it's not just softwood lumber. Softwood lumber gets all the ink, all the press, and it should get some of the press. But gypsum and so on and so forth, other materials, not to mention labor costs in the context of a very constrained labor market. We have seen softwood lumber prices retreat just a bit recently. The cure for high prices is high prices, by the way. You remember this from economics. When prices are high, quantity demanded goes down, and quantity supplied goes up. The problem right now is quantity supplied can't really go up that much because you got that vertical supply curve, you're hitting capacity constraints. But theoretically, at least over the longer term, supply should adjust, or quantity supplied. So one of the segments I would say to you that's going to be very strong is single-family building. And part of the reason for this is, again, altered behavior. This is in millions. You see the red-colored bar there? That reflects the 2 million people who moved out of principal cities last year in America, whether it was Chicago, New York, Seattle, Minneapolis, whatever it happened to be. You see the blue-colored bar there? That's the 3 million people who moved into American suburbs. Some came from urban areas, some came from rural areas, didn't have broadband, whatever it happened to be. Some came from abroad, as many Americans came back from abroad, remember, during the early stages of the pandemic. But they moved disproportionately to the suburbs. So the desire for home ownership is on. And again, the supply, the inventory of available units is very constrained, so no surprise, prices are rising, but it's not necessarily a bubble. Now, at some point, when the prices of homes begins to fall, you'll say, see, Basu was wrong. They should not have given him that award. It was a bubble. At some point, prices will begin to fall. That's true. Why? Number one, at some point, mortgage rates will rise. And that will truncate buying power. That's one. But that doesn't mean there's a bubble necessarily, a speculative bubble. Mortgage rates can adjust. Two, we are starting to see things like private equity get into home building, including building more homes for rental purposes. And so they could ultimately oversupply the market. These things swing like a pendulum, so that's possible. But as of this moment, is there a housing bubble in America? There is not. Now, what about the rental market? I would say to you, or suggest to you, that the value of proximity has declined because of the pandemic, maybe permanently. Here's what I mean by that. Ask yourself the question, why is Manhattan so expensive? Proximity. To what? Fabulous labor market, many high-paying jobs. 2 largest central business districts in America are in Manhattan. That's the Financial District, Lower Manhattan, and of course, Midtown. Broadway, Central Park, fabulous dining scene, great nightlife, views of New Jersey and Brooklyn and the Bronx. But in a world of remote work, which is sticky, as it turns out, because of preferences have changed, online shopping and streaming of Netflix, proximity is not nearly as valuable. And you can see some of that in that left-hand column here. These are rent changes in select American communities between March and December of last year. So what I'm trying to say is between March and December of last year, apartment rents in San Francisco fell 27%. And in Seattle, 22%, Boston, 21%, New York, 20%, Washington and San Jose, 15%. Proximity declined in value. Now, true, some of these folks are moving back to the cities now, but often paying less rent than they were pre-pandemic. They're being induced by these lower rents. Now, rents did not decline everywhere. Yes, there has been a push toward home ownership, but a lot of this is a reflection of migration patterns. So if you look at the right-hand column here, you'll see that there are some communities which did not suffer rental decreases. So a lot of people have talked about a lot about the fact that California lost population last year for the first time in more than 120 years, at least 120 years. They spent less time talking about the fact that a lot of the migration in California was inside the state. People are moving from San Francisco to Fresno or Los Angeles to Bakersfield. If you're going to be watching Netflix or Hulu or HBO Max or Paramount Plus, you might as well do it from Fresno. Don't need to be in San Francisco for that. This is another way of looking at things. You see the dark purple line there? That's the rent decline sustained in principal cities during the 12 months of last year. That's where the rents declined. Not in suburban cities, because that's not where the population declined. Suburban rental markets are reasonably strong, is what I'm trying to say. So I'm from Baltimore. So our suburban cities are the likes of Towson, Columbia, Ellicott City, White Marsh, Hunt Valley, Owings Mills, Pikesville, Catonsville, Bel Air, Westminster, Manchester, Hampstead, Severna Park, Glen Burnie, Annapolis. I could go on, I think I am. The point is, that's where the population is declining. That's not where it's dissipating from. It's the principal cities. Let's talk about commercial construction. Again, another leading indicator, the Architecture Billings Index. You see the 50-yard line running west-east across that slide. Any reading less than 50 means that architects are less busy this month than they were last month. Now, you can see during the early stages of the pandemic, and people in this audience know this, architects were busily getting less busy. Well, of course, projects were drying up. The last 5 months or so, you can see architects getting busier, and some architects have come up to me after presentation and said, we are just as busy as we were pre-pandemic. Well, why? What are we building? Well, it could be all kinds of things, but office vacancy rates are high. But of course, there's lots of office refurbishment taking place. Retail vacancy is high, so there might not be a lot of new retail space under construction, but a lot of this is being adaptively reused for other purposes. So, in any case, fair amount of project design. And why is this a leading indicator? Because if architects are busy upstream, construction firms will be busy downstream. That's the notion. So this is quite promising. But still somewhat surprising to me, given that we're still down 7 million jobs since the pandemic began, that architects have become so busy so quickly. I think, again, I have an explanation for this. Given all the vacancy, why are architects so busy? Liquidity. Private equity firms, hedge funds, others, endowments, have so much capital to deploy right now. They've got to put it someplace, and often that translates into buying an existing building and refurbishing it, or new construction. To a certain extent, what I'm trying to say here is that it is the tail wagging the dog. And this is because of all these liquidity injections, particularly coming out of the Federal Reserve, $120 billion a month. $120 billion a month. That's almost Jeff Bezos' fortune injected into the U.S. economy a month. I saw recently that he is no longer the richest man in the world, at least he wasn't for a bit of a time, that distinction went to one Bernard Jean Etienne Arnault, the CEO of LVMH, Louis Vuitton. In any case, eventually the Americans will win, and Jeff Bezos will be number one again. He's been distracted by going to space, that kind of thing. So, and even though the leading indicator is positive, the coincidental indicator is negative. This is non-residential construction put in place. You see the dark blue segment there? That's private construction. So, we just got data on this just the last few days for June. And June construction spending, or non-residential construction spending, was down from May. And we've seen this pattern. We're well off the peak that was achieved just before the pandemic began, or as the pandemic was beginning. And when I speak to contractors, they say, Anirban, our backlog has been rising. We expect in the next 6 months our sales will grow, our staffing will grow, but here's the big one. Our profit margins will grow. There's enough demand for our services that we actually have pricing power. We might be able to grow margins. I find this remarkable. Given that their labor costs are rising, they're dealing with materials price increases, which we'll talk about in just 1 second, and yet they're confident. What I also hear them saying, and this might be somewhat alarming to users of construction services, is that what they're seeing more recently is fewer people bidding on projects. Now, why might there be fewer contractors bidding on emerging projects? One could be, of course, they're out of business. They're not there to bid anymore. I don't think that's it. I think a lot of these construction firms are at capacity. They can't take on any more projects. And so what you're seeing now, again, that vertical supply curve, and what does that translate into? Rising cost. You put an infrastructure package on top of that, which I'm not saying is good or bad policy, but it's policy that might be coming down the pike. That would tend to even increase further those construction cost increases. Some construction users I've spoken to have asked me the question, Anirban, should we delay the project start? Should we just postpone it? Let's say for a couple of months, and then we might get more favorable bids. I've heard that a lot. I say to them, I think it's going to take more than a couple of months for these markets to clear. These capacity constraints are right now, they're sticky, and there are a lot of other firms out there because they're trying to deploy capital right now. They have to deploy the capital. If you're a private equity firm and people are shoving money in your direction, you must invest that money for them. You use it or you lose it. You want to generate fees, you must deploy the capital. Again, some of this is the tail wagging the dog, but it has economic implications. Now, part of the reason I'm surprised that architects are getting busier so rapidly is this. It relates to what was built prior to the pandemic. So as defined by the U.S. Census Bureau, there are 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country. All are reflected here. And this reflects the percentage change in construction spending for each of these 16 categories for the 5-year period, February 2015 to February 2020. Why this period? 5 years, ending with the last pre-pandemic crisis month. Just trying to get you a sense of, or give you a sense of, what we were building a lot of as the pandemic approached. So at the top is public safety. So that was all that spending to turn the Javits Center in New York to a temporary hospital, that kind of thing. So that's why that shows up at number 1. So that spending was taking place before the crisis really begins. At number 2 is office. We built a ton of office space in this country just before a pandemic. Just before we realized that many Americans are as productive or more productive working from home as in the office. You see, the conventional wisdom coming into the pandemic was this. I can allow my workers to work from home. It'll save me real estate costs. I won't have to lease so much office space, but I will lose productivity and I'll lose responsiveness to my clientele. I cannot afford that to happen. They're coming into the office. What's the conventional wisdom now? Different, at least among many employers. My workers were just as productive or more productive working from home, and here's the thing, they were much happier. And now they insist upon working from home, at least a couple of days a week. It turns out the office is filled with distraction. We are human beings. So, we come off this grueling commute where people are really rude when they're in their cars, aren't they? They cut you off, they won't let you merge in, all that stuff. It happens to everyone. It's nothing personal against you. Everyone suffers it. Now you're in the office. So what as a human being do you start doing? You start contemplating other human beings. It's what we do. Then we put down our stuff. Then we go to the water cooler to talk to those human beings about other human beings. We might have some water. Coffee break number 1, coffee break number 2, coffee break number 3, free Splenda. It is irresistible. Then an impromptu staff meeting that someone thought was a good idea. It was not. Then lunch. And then after lunch, of course, filling out your NCAA bracket, not once or twice, but 15 or 16 times because you're trying to figure out if Tulsa can beat St. John's and you want to win the bloody thing. Now, there are distractions in the home, and we know who and what they are. Neighbors, pets, children, daytime soaps, and sports center. But it turns out studies coming from China, Germany, America, elsewhere suggest many folks are as productive or more productive working from home. Not good for the office market. Same 16 categories, but now the period February 2020 to June of 2021. So pre-pandemic to the latest month for which we have data. At the very bottom is lodging. That's your hotel construction. Because one of the things we also did, I'll go back to the previous slide, is we built a ton of hotel rooms, that's lodging, just before the pandemic. Now, leisure travel is coming back pretty aggressively. I think you would agree with that. Americans are on the move in terms of leisure travel. You can see that here in Orlando. But business travel, I'm told, in fact, by the folks at the audiovisual table back there, very good entrepreneur back there, as it turns out, taking a long time to come back. This is an exception, not the rule, is what I'm trying to say. So for hotels that have this kind of space that specialize in serving a commercial clientele, those market segments probably will be weak for quite some time to come. So you can see that again in the slide. Lodging is the weakest, 37.8%. Office, negative 14.5%, but that's misleading. Why? Because the office component also includes data centers. And of course, data center construction is fast and furious, whether in Northern Virginia or other parts of the country. Fulfillment center construction is fast and furious. Why? Well, because those are backbones of the e-commerce economy. Bless you. Now, one of the other things, of course, that's been happening, and that really, I think, threatens the non-residential construction recovery in particular, but also the residential construction recovery, materials prices. Oh, some of my labels got obfuscated here, but again, February 2020 versus June of 2021, actually they disappeared, but softwood lumber prices up 141% over that period. Yeah, softwood lumber prices have fallen recently, that's true, nonetheless up 141% between February 2020 and June of 2021. By the way, your experience may be different. So there are different things happening in different parts of the country. The circumstances in Boise, Idaho, which is booming, are much different from, let's say, Portland, Oregon, which right now is not. So there are regional variations, there are different definitions. Steel mill product prices up 81.6%. By one measure, steel prices have tripled since the pandemic began. But that doesn't speak to steel mill products in particular, that kind of thing. But in any case, here we are with the inflation. Final section of the presentation, the forecast. Let me do some crystal balling for you. Now, we economists like to excessively complicate matters, and we do this on purpose. And it's because if you don't, the notion is if you don't understand what we're saying, you'll deem us to be highly intelligent. But as it turns out in economics, it boils down to two things. It's boiled down to two things for hundreds of years, let's say since Adam Smith. It'll boil down to two things in hundreds of years to come. It is demand and supply. That's all you get. That's all it is. And in America, the principal source of demand in the economy is the American household. It's the consumer spending. You've heard of the statement a million times. The consumer is 2/3 of the economy. What they really are 2/3 of aggregate demand. And because of their outsized importance, we don't just focus upon what the consumer is doing, what they're buying, how much they're buying, what prices they're paying. We do all of that. But on top of that, we monitor their psychology. Are they happy? Are they confident? Do they like the president? Here's the University of Michigan's Index of Consumer Sentiment. And the consumer is psychologically exactly where you think they would be. They're not as despondent as they were pre-crisis. I should say, they're not as despondent as they were early in the crisis, but they're not as confident as they were pre-crisis. So when the folks in Michigan are not being hammered by Ohio State, they also like to produce this index. It is the other thing that they do. But I can make the argument to you, despite this so-so perspective on the world coming out of the consumers in America, that American consumers have never been in better financial shape than they are right now. Never. Now, at some level, that sounds awfully insensitive. I know and you know that many Americans are facing eviction, that many Americans lost health insurance when they needed it most during the crisis, that many Americans face food insecurity, can't keep up with their student debt, have fallen behind on their credit card payments, all of that. Microeconomics, individual families, in many cases struggling, true. But macroeconomically, big picture, American consumers are in great shape. This is the U.S. savings rate. This is savings as a percentage of personal disposable income. This is basically a reflection of how much money people take out of their paychecks every couple of weeks and set aside into some account. Could be savings, could be 401k, but they're not spending it right away, that's the point. Coming into the pandemic, the savings rate is around 8%. By April of 2020, that's a big peak you see here, it's 33.7%. Spending opportunities have disappeared, can't go to restaurants, can't take a vacation, money's coming to the household, step up unemployment insurance payments, stimulus payments, income from work. As late as June, the savings rate is still 9.4%, and Americans have accumulated nearly $3 trillion in excess savings during the crisis. That's money that's ready to be spent. So that's what you're seeing out there right now, this unbelievable spending. You go to any mall out there, it'll be slammed. Go to Disney Springs today, it'll be slammed with people. So why is the economy not really taking off? Why did it grow 6.5% during the second quarter and not the 8% or 10% that many economists expected? Because it takes two to make a thing go right. Quoting Rob Bass, 1988, the great rapper. Now, you might say to me, Anirban, wait up. That song was not about the economy. You're wrong, it was. And also, that song involved the efforts of one DJ Easy Rock. And of course, it takes two to make a thing go right. Obviously, there are two of them. I'm sorry to say that DJ Easy Rock passed in 2014 from diabetic seizure, proving yet again that while it takes two to make a thing go right, it only takes one to make a thing go terribly wrong. And what's the problem here? What's causing things to go wrong? The supply side of the economy. We've been talking about this. We've talked about global supply chains in disarray, the supply constraints, but also lack of optimism among small businesses. This is the NFIB's, or National Federation of Independent Business Index of Small Business Optimism. Question, Small Business America, is it a good time to expand your business? In June, only 15% said yes, it is, over the next 3 months. They're worried about inflation. They're hoarding cash. They can't find workers. They're thinking about the Delta variant. Takes two to make a thing go right. And right now, its demand is strong, supply is not there yet, so the economy is constrained in terms of its pace of recovery. Still rapid by historic standards, but not quite there. Final slide. For an economy to flourish, both demand and supply sides of the economy must participate. With ongoing stimulus, demand will get a further boost, assuming that the Biden administration is able to get something done. But supply continues to be constrained by numerous factors, and not just in America. Many of us are vaccinated. And those of us who aren't probably have maybe chosen not to be vaccinated. In many other countries, vaccination programs have scarcely begun. In many countries, only 1% of the population has received even one dose of vaccine to date. The global supply chain is still in disarray. The result is that the U.S. savings rate will remain elevated in the near term, continue to spring-load the economy for rapid growth once supply really catches up with demand, which will happen at some point later this year into 2022, another V-shaped recovery. The back half of 2021 should be spectacular for economic growth, though the Delta variant is there. They'll take some of the edge off this economic recovery. However, there will be a day of reckoning as deficit hawks come back into fashion. We've amassed a massive national debt to get to this point. We're going to pay for this. There is no free lunch. Anyone who knows Greg Palmer knows that to be the case. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you. It's been a privilege.
Thank you, Anirban. Everybody hear me?
Nope.
I can. I can hear you.
I'll talk a little louder. Oh, there we go.
yeah.
There we go. Okay. Thank you, Anirban. So we'll start off with a softball question. What happened to the longer hair you used to have, and did it have anything to do with being in Ravenclaw?
Yeah, no. Many years ago, today I comb my hair forward to hide my forehead. But back then, I'd slick my hair back, and then I grew it really long in the back. And that's because one of my clients, happened to be from Associated Builders and Contractors, insisted that to be their chief economist, I had to cut my hair. And so then I proceeded not to cut my hair for 2 years. And so that was just rebelliousness. Thank you very much.
So there is a lot of questions here about labor. I'll try to group them as much as I can.
Right.
Is everyone just out playing Quidditch?
Is everyone playing Quidditch? Yeah, everyone's quitting is what's happening. So the quit rate in America is very high right now. Labor force participation is very low. People expect something different from their jobs. They're also looking, I should have mentioned this, for social mission. There's just so many boxes that an individual job has to check for someone to fill that job. It's not just about wages and benefits and so on and so forth. A lot of people, I think, don't want to work outdoors. This is one of the reasons that construction has difficulty, finding workers. And of course, women don't enter the construction trades in the numbers that I think one would like. It's a male-dominated industry still. So all kinds of issues there, but I think there's a cultural factor here. And I was talking to a lot of folks before the presentation, and they said America's work ethic seems to have changed. And I will say, and I perceive this, that older generations tended to value work more than younger generations do. And people might disagree with me, and I know there's some star millennial workers out there, don't get me wrong. But I think baby boomers and Generation X, which is what I'm a member of, we are much more committed to the world of work than younger generations are today. I'll say them more.
So you mentioned social mission. A lot of that kind of leads automatically to volunteerism. So is the stimulus payments enabling that? Is that part of what's contributing to the labor shortage?
I don't think so. So one of the presentations I delivered last week was to a group of fire chiefs around the country and into Canada, though the Canadians couldn't come because of their restrictions. And one of the things we've seen is during the pandemic, it's been actually more difficult to get volunteer firefighters. So people are getting stimulus payments. That gives them more economic ability to be a volunteer firefighter, to not do something that's generating income, for instance. But what they have found is that, in fact, people have just been disappearing from the volunteer firefighting workforce. So no, again, something has changed in us. And I hope it's just temporary, that that desire to get back to work will really come back. And I suspect to a certain extent it will, as people have to start paying bills in earnest again. Can't rely on stimulus payments to pay bills. And that will get people back to work. But again, something has changed out there, and we just don't seem to value that wage and salary level as much as we once did. That's my view. You just can't bribe people into work sometimes.
So for the folks that aren't going to be returning to work, the retirees that you talked about, do you have any information on how many people are we really talking about that have taken that road?
Oh, millions. Yeah, millions have retired earlier than they expected. Now, it's true that a lot of the folks who have retired earlier than expected are over the age of 65. So they plan on working to the age of 75, but they retired now. So the labor force participation rate among 65 to 69-year-olds in this country is down 2 percentage points since the pandemic began. The labor force participation rate among 55 to 59-year-olds, by contrast, is down 0.6%. So by early retirement, I'm not talking necessarily about very young people, but they're retiring earlier than they had anticipated for whatever reason.
So the flip side of that, so we talked about the labor. What about the productivity side? Will the pandemic become a springboard for employers to utilize more AI options, particularly automation, to replace jobs to try to keep up with demand?
No question that what you're going to see and already have started to see is a boom in investment in human replacing technologies. AI is, of course, part of that, but so is 3D printing. So is robotics. You'll see much more of this going forward. And many societies are way ahead of us in terms of this. The Japanese society, for instance, is way ahead of us. Robots take care of people. You can't have enough home health workers. Robots take care of people these days. You're going to see much more of that. We have now robotic bricklayers. You're going to see much more of that going forward. And by the way, the best and brightest workers often want to work in technology-rich settings. So embracing new technologies is also a recruitment mechanism, as it turns out. And many of the most effective construction firms actually operate more like technology firms than construction contractors.
Looking ahead, President Biden has a plan to essentially waive fees for education. What impact do you see that having on labor, and what can we do as the construction industry to capitalize on that?
Right. So, again, this notion is tuition-free two-year colleges, for instance, I think is what you're getting at. So I guess I'm old-fashioned, that, you appreciate something more if you pay for it. But set that aside, we all, of course, have free public school education, pre-K through 12, for instance, in many areas. So there's that. But I think what you're going to get is a lot of people who will enroll in a two-year college. It's free. What do they have to lose? And then they'll drop out. And this will further constrain capacity for two-year colleges with respect to those people who are actually going to those two-year colleges, would happily pay, but won't have to, but that's fine. But they're actually looking to get a two-year degree, an associate degree, and do something really meaningful with their world of work. In any case, I'm not a big fan of such things. But again, people out there can disagree with me, of course.
So going a little further up the pipeline, what should we do to leverage infrastructure and other stimulus to create new interest in high schools for a construction craft career track, understanding what the next generation's expectations are for flex work, work-life balance, career growth? We
should bring back shop class. So the reason that disappeared is because we're in a world of high-stakes testing. So the notion is, many years ago, the Americans scored very badly on the test in international math and science, the TIMSS. So Americans were routinely toward the bottom of the developed world in terms of testing in math and science, and very average in terms of the emerging world. So the notion was, our kids are falling behind, we need to test them more, and we got into this world of high-stakes testing. So it's always about preparing for the next test, the standardized test. And of course, before that, we had SATs and ACTs and all of those kinds of things. So now, kids are being taught to the test. If I'm trying to get a kid, if I'm an administrator, and I'm graded on how many of my kids pass reading, math, social studies, so on and so forth, those standardized tests, I'm not taking a kid out of English class to put them in a shop class. I'm not taking them even on a field trip to visit a construction site. No way. I'm not graded on that. So they are not exposed to all of those potential opportunities. Many older workers in shop class learn that they love to work with their minds and hands at the same time, and they like to see tangible evidence of their output. Many of us who work in the service sector, myself included, we don't have a lot of tangible output, other than the award, of course. So in any case, we need to change culturally. And I think also one of the other things that we need to do is we need to revere a job that's well done in any context. And there's this snobbishness, I think, about work in construction and manufacturing and fulfillment centers and so on and so forth. I had an argument a few years ago with the Washington, D.C. City Council. They had wanted to pass a Walmart bill to keep Walmart out of the city because these are Walmart jobs. They're not good jobs. And I said to them, Madam Chairwoman, members of this committee, it's not for you to say what's a good job or what's not a good job. If somebody shows up to Walmart to work, and 1.4 million people at that time each day show up to Walmart to work, that's telling you what? That's their best option that day. Otherwise, they would not be showing up to that Walmart to work. It's the axiom of revealed preference. And so to denigrate that work, I think, is not productive. In any case, we need to get over it.
So we talked about the technical schools, we talked about high school. Let's go a little further up the pipeline. What do you think the economic impact will be if birth rates continue to lag behind death rates? According to the Wall Street Journal, half of US states had death rates higher than birth rates.
Yes, the American female fertility rate is now 1.73. Replacement fertility is 2.1. We're just not having enough sex, and we're not giving birth to as many babies. And so it's problematic. Now, how do you backfill that? You backfill that with immigration. But our immigration policy is sloppy. We don't know how to enforce it. We don't know what it is. I'm talking about both legal and illegal immigration. And one of my fears had been several years ago that Congress would conflate illegal and legal immigration. There are two very separate issues with very different types of solutions, but they conflated the two. And so we have slowed immigration to America. We have lowered birth rates. We're getting older. We have Social Security Trust Fund that goes insolvent in 2034 or 2035. We have a Medicare Trust Fund that goes insolvent in 2026. And we do not have enough workers to support that trust fund or get the work done of the American people. I'm talking from an economy-wide perspective. So, look, I like immigration. Look at me. And I think we got to, figure this out.
Okay, so switching gears from labor now to hard numbers economies, I hear American savings are at an all-time high. What are the near and midterm effects of that? Is there restricted demand that will eventually break loose, or did this change people to be more savers and less discretionary spenders?
No, I don't think Americans have learned anything about this. This was because money was coming into the household and it could not be readily spent. I can't take a vacation to Hawaii. I can't go to a ball game. I can't go to a theater. Can't see the movie. I can stream Netflix, but that only costs me a few dollars a month. So the savings rate went up. You're starting to see the savings rate come back down to pre-pandemic levels, 9.4% last month. The last month for which we have data, pre-pandemic was 8%. So, and eventually, I think we'll go below 8% as Americans will start spending, because that's who we are. We spend. After 9/11, what did the president at that time ask of us? Spend money. We did. That was our fight on terrorism. We won. So, I don't think I think it's just a short-term phenomenon. We Americans have not changed culturally. I will say one thing, however. Young people, millennials and Generation Z is now the youngest members entering the workforce, do seem to be better savers than older generations. So there is that. But, again, from a macroeconomic perspective, I don't think we've learned a thing.
So following up on that question, would you attribute the most record recovery of retail sales to be stimulus payments being spent? In other words, is this sustainable?
Oh, no, it's not sustainable. Here's the thing. The outlook in the near term into 2022 is great because it's demand-driven. I'll give you an example. Here's what I'm talking about. We can talk about Delta variant. We can talk about inflation. We can talk about all kinds of things. Dysfunction in Washington. There was in 2011 a playoff game between the Seattle Seahawks and the New Orleans Saints. Fourth quarter, late. New Orleans is winning. They hand the ball off. Seattle has the ball, hands the ball off to Marshawn Lynch. Now, you can talk about New Orleans linebackers. They're hard-hitting safeties, all that kind of stuff. Marshawn Lynch breaks 9 tackles and scores. Seattle goes nuts. What's my point here? My point here is that there is one factor that's so strong right now that it overwhelms all other considerations, including the Delta variant. It's aggregate demand. Demand for goods and services is so elevated, it is Marshawn Lynch. That's what's going to take us to the house into 2022 from the perspective of economic strength. But at some point, we come, off the table, right? Because the stimulus goes away, and what are we left with? An economy with lower labor force participation. A lot of our best workers have retired. Rising interest rates, still, inflationary pressures. We're going to fall off the table. I don't want to mention that to the audience because I want people to be upbeat leaving here. But at some point in 2023 or 2024, the economic outlook could be very different. We'll see.
Well, we're out of time, so thank you very much, Anirban. Unfortunately, that was the last one.
Thank you very much.
All right, so it's time for that 5-letter word that begins with the letter L. But before I actually say it, I'd just like to remind everybody to be back in this room, and we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock. So enjoy your lunch, everybody.